Today on the Road to Recovery podcast, we have another amazing guest on as we invite on Tabitha Farrar. She is an eating disorder recovery coach. She's actually battled an eating disorder in the past. She's an author of one of the greatest books that helped me massively in my recovery, which is called Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover. Today we want to talk about the myths surrounding eating disorders, the genetic component of eating disorders, how it's like living with an eating disorder, because a lot of people don't really understand how complex it is, the stigma that involves, especially as a man suffering with an eating disorder, but the stigma in general suffering with an eating disorder, and how we have that constant hunger because we've deprived ourselves of so much in terms of calories and nutrients, and our body's starving as well. So this is a great conversation, guys. I hope you take something away with it. If you like the content that we put out on the channel, please give us a big subscribe. It would mean the world to help us support the work we do, and obviously share the video as well. Without further ado, let's get straight into it.
Hi, welcome back to the Road to Recovery podcast. I am joined here as always with my illustrious guest host, Tommy Kelly. And today we have the honor of being graced by ED recovery coach, Tabitha Farrar. I hope I pronounced that right.
You did.
I'm good. Okay, I practiced for like 20 minutes every day in the shower the last week to make sure I got this right. But she is someone who herself has recovered from 12 years of anorexia without professional treatment or support, and now offers hers to others, which is awesome. And she's been an active advocate for destigmatizing eating disorders and developing better recovery resources for adults. And she's an author of 2 books, which both of them I really need to check out. That's Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover. That one is the one that I want to talk about later today. And also her first book, Love Fat, which I think is the best title ever, Love Fat, an Autobiography. So the first thing I really wanted to talk about is you've been a pretty great voice for trying to, as I mentioned before, destigmatize eating disorders, especially in adults like us, or people that have carried on eating disorder tendencies for many years. Mm-hmm. And so what I wanted to ask you was, what do you think has been personally your greatest hurdle in this endeavor of trying to destigmatize eating disorders?
Oh, that's a good question. The sort of, oh God, there's been so many hurdles, honestly. I wouldn't know which the biggest one is. I think my personal biggest hurdle is being taken seriously just because I'm not a medical doctor. And so being taken seriously as an expert by experience, I think that I can even, because I've written, 2, now 3. I published a 3rd book last year. And when I first wrote Love Fat, I actually tried to go through the route of getting a publisher, which is, I think, a bit overrated. But I thought that's what you do when you write a book, isn't it? You got to get a publisher. And because I was writing about eating disorders, and because I'm not a doctor, I haven't got an MD after my name, I absolutely couldn't get any interest from anyone. And that, I think, has been across the board. That was especially as I started out talking about eating disorders. It's just really difficult to get people to take you seriously if you don't have MD after your name. And so I think that for me, that's been the biggest hurdle, is just actually getting people who are doctors, who are therapists or in the media to actually listen to anybody that's not a doctor.
Right. It's actually rather interesting because, as you mentioned that, and it's the same way. So I have another chronic illness, which isn't part of this podcast, but I've noticed that really, in order to get word out, especially with like eating disorders, people don't tend to listen to it, which is kind of counterintuitive, because you think the people that have gone through it would really have the most experience with those type of illnesses.
Absolutely. Yeah, and in other fields such as recovering from substance abuse, it's actually the people that have experienced that are given the greater credibility and listened to more. And so in different fields, that's absolutely not the way. And in other fields, experts by experience really lead the field. It's just not the way it's been with eating disorders. And I think that one of the primary reasons for that is that eating disorders have been sort of considered this psychological mystery that only a therapist can delve into and possibly understand. And now that when I say we, I mean the field is uncovering the genetic locus for eating disorders, and it's being seen more as a biologically influenced illness. I think that that's shifting, and it's getting a lot easier.
So could you maybe tell us, just for viewers that don't know, just a brief history of your experience with eating disorders, in a stint, your 12 years that you went through?
Yeah, so I was a late developer. I didn't even have a hint of an eating disorder until I was almost 18. I was 17 at the time, so it was maybe halfway through my 17th year. And I certainly didn't have any body dysmorphia. I didn't have I actually quite, for a 17-year-old girl, I quite like my body. Which is kind of strange, but that most 17-year-old girls, I think, can't say that. But I was like, you know what? My body's great. I was like really ego little kid. And so that really wasn't my issue at all. I developed my eating disorder because I decided I needed to lose some weight, or when needed is not the right word. I wanted to lose some weight because I'm 6 foot, so I'm quite tall, and I was an exercise jockey at the time, riding racehorses. And so I was heavy just because of my height. Most exercise jockeys are these tiny little Irish lads, and I wasn't that. And so I just wanted to lose 5 pounds. It wasn't a lot of weight. I was like 5 pounds. And then I'd actually be given a ride on a horse that was a bit smaller that I really liked. And so that's what kicked it off. And I didn't have a clue what I was doing. I was like, I need to lose 5 pounds. I'll just not eat for a week or so. And then it all went down the pan after that, because I lost the 5 pounds, but my plan had been I'll lose the 5 pounds and then I'm just going to get back to stuffing my face with food as usual. And I guess you guys probably all know how that goes.
Yeah.
You go into energy deficit and then it's not quite as easy as beginning to eat again. And I didn't have a clue. I didn't know. So I was just like, oh, well, evidently I'm not very hungry. I guess that's not a problem. I didn't think it was a problem that I wasn't very hungry. I was like, I guess, that's fine. If I'm not that hungry, I don't have to make myself eat. So I didn't. And then I lost even more weight and then fell very, very severely into anorexia. Which was largely for me restriction and a huge exercise compulsion.
Yeah, and that's very similar to what me and Tommy went through. And we actually both developed late stage, as you said, type of anorexic behavior.
I was about 17 years old, but obviously because of the loss of my mum, so a bit different, but the exact same thing. It obviously morphed into exercise addiction as well. So
yeah, and so then that was a good 10 years of that. I was around, I guess, 27, 28 when I began, I don't know, I guess I began recovery younger than that. It was more like 26, but then, it takes a long while to figure it out. So that took years to, it wasn't like I decided, I'm going to go into recovery and I was recovered the next day. That took a long time because there wasn't any guidance either. There wasn't even recovery blogs when I was doing that. So I just didn't have a clue what I was doing and was working it out as I went along. And so, but then when I was getting more recovered and then fully recovered, I started to look back and I just thought, I was like, what a shit show that 10 years was. And I realized that if I had known, say even at 18, 19, I think if I'd known that my problem was an eating disorder, I would have sorted it out. I just didn't know. And none of my doctors said you have an eating disorder either. And part of the reason for that is because they got this little tick box and it's sort of like, 13 to 14-year-old onset. And they're looking at me as an 18, 19-year-old going, oh, well, she's too old to have an eating disorder. And they've got another tick box that says severe body dysmorphia. And they're looking at me with no history of body dysmorphia, actually quite like my body. And when I was underweight, I knew I was underweight and I didn't like that. I still wasn't able to gain weight, but I didn't have body dysmorphia. So again, they were sort of, oh, well, she can't have an eating disorder. Then no history of trauma either. So obviously she hasn't got an eating disorder. And so at that time, because the little tick box that my GP had didn't match up with my attitude, the type of person that I was, my age, they were just sort of like, oh, well, it can't be that. Maybe she's just skinny and likes to run a lot. and so I just sort of got a little bit annoyed about that, I guess, that something that became so obvious to me when I started to understand a little bit more about how my eating disorder worked, that nobody really picked up on it. And if they had, they just tried to shove a bit of therapy down my throat, a bit backyard therapy from the GP there. What's it like at home? What are your parents are like? Did anybody ever slap you around? And I was just like, no, my parents are great and always have been. And that really actually put me off therapy. I was like, if they're going to try and pin this on my mum and dad, I'm not going. And so I was really put off therapy and I didn't go. And all of that, I think, could have been different. And if it had been different around the age when I was 18, 19, I think I probably could have saved myself 10 years of hell. And so hence wanting to talk about that a lot and start pointing out the problems in eating disorder treatment and the stigma, and see if we can make a bit of change there.
Similar genetic.
Everything evolved for a reason. Everything. Yeah. I don't believe any of it is a mistake. I feel like a lot of different what we consider to be physical and mental disorders are actually in a certain environment not disordered at all, but incredibly functional. Mm-hmm. So all of these things would have evolved for a reason. And one of the problems that I think that worries me about now that we are actually, and the fields are looking into genetic influences for all of these things, especially in the eating disorder and the diet industry. I wish that we could just be like, what? Body's smarter than we are. We should just let it be the way it needs to be and stay out of it, because we don't actually need to know what our body's genetic response to energy deficit is. And we don't need to try and fix that. We just need to not go into energy deficit. But you can guess that what the diet industry is going to be is they're going to be like, well, we've got a diet for people with this genetic response to energy deficit, and we can get around your genetic response and still make you skinny. That's what I think is the problem is going to start to be as we actually find out more about these things. So I wish that humans would be like, what? Body's really smart, and it's not going to just agree with me that I should be skinnier than it wants to be. Let's leave it as it is. And
unfortunately, that's kind of the never-ending battle when you're talking about health, is it's always, in the end, like any industry is about how can it make money in a new way to trick. So it's always going to be some sort of stigmatizing problem that you're just going to have to constantly, it's like politics. You have to constantly remind people of facts.
Yes.
And so it's kind of the same thing. And
I was going to say what you'd already talked about before about the kind of body weight and things like that. That's one thing that I think is important to put out there. Like, you've spoken about it a lot, obviously, that your body knows what its optimum weight is.
So much more information. The body has so much more information about what its optimally healthy weight should be than any doctor, any dietitian. Nutritional science can't even begin to touch on how much energy our bodies actually use each day. Yeah. Because if you think that you know how many calories your body needs each day, then you answer me this question now. In this minute, how many calories did your little finger use? How many calories did your liver use? Do you know exactly what cells did your liver repair today? And how many calories per cell did that take? The answer is that we actually don't know shit about what's going on in here. Yeah. We do not know what's happening. We do not know how much energy it takes. But the glorious thing is, once again, we don't need to. We just need to listen to the body and tell it, eat what it tells us to eat, because it is communicating with us all the time as to how much it needs. The problem is we're in a culture that teaches us that we can't trust our bodies to manage our food intake and our weight, and develops mistrust between the signals that our bodies give us and is saying, you can't trust that. If your body's hungry and your body's telling you that you want chocolate cake, you should eat nuts. Because we're being given those messages the whole time, it just creates this gap between what is a very simple and honest communication from your body as to what it needs and what you actually give it, which is not health.
Right. It's so speaking of this, we've been kind of talking about, right, the idea of how your brain is wired, what it's naturally wired. So how does someone go from like this state of, because me and Tommy, we're like exactly the same. Our biggest problem, I think, and I don't want to tell you, Tommy, what your problem was, because you know better than me. But for me, it was completely the movement thing. I literally didn't sit down all day. Like, no matter if I was sitting, it was in a plank formation.
I would even go like that with my hands when I was sitting and had to fidget constantly.
So when you talk about like rewiring in your second book, like rewiring your brain, how can someone kind of begin that path?
Yeah, so, I wrote about rewiring quite a lot in Rehabilitate, Rewire, Recover. And then I wrote another book last year, which was just quite literally neural rewiring for eating disorder recovery. Because I thought, you know what, I'm just going to completely spell out the neural rewiring stuff. And the first step to being able to neurally rewire anything is being able to identify it. Mm-hmm. That's the first step, to be able to identify, I do this thing. And that's also the hardest step, is definitely the recognizing it's a problem. And then once you've recognized the problem, actually the hardest step is committing to changing it. That's definitely the hardest step. Because, yeah. And so, because like I keep saying, people with eating disorders are massively stubborn, determined, and some of us, I think we know, I kind of knew that if I said to myself, I am not going running for a year, when I was going cold turkey on exercise, I knew that if I said that to myself, I knew I would not go running for a year. And so that kind of scared me. To commit to it scared me because I knew I'd follow through. And then, of course, my eating disorder brain didn't like that. And so often committing to actually rewiring the thing that we need to rewire is kind of the biggest step, not because you don't think you can do it. It's actually because you know you can do it. And that's kind of scary because it will probably result in weight gain. That's the whole with the movement thing. I knew I could make myself stop, but that was scary because that would likely lead to weight gain, wouldn't it? And so always at the root of everything, I began to notice that fear of weight gain was at the root of why I didn't want to do everything. And that was difficult for me because I was not a person that liked being thin. And so, but I still had to say, look, I don't like being thin, but my actions every day, I'm acting like a person who doesn't want to gain weight. And so then I realized, if I want to teach my brain that weight gain is not a threat to me, I have to stop acting as if weight gain is a threat to me. Because our brains are always watching. Our brains watch our actions and our brains learn from our actions. And so understanding that if you want to change your brain's belief, if you want to change the way that your brain is wired, you have to start acting consistently different. And you'd be surprised at how quickly the brain will change. The brain will resist because it doesn't want to change because you've taught it this is the way I should be, brain. And the brain's like, yeah, this is the way you should be. But if you consistently act a different way, days to weeks, your brain will be like, all right, this is the new way we should be. It actually cottons on pretty fast. It gives you a load of resistance. And it's like, no, human, we shouldn't change. You taught me we shouldn't change. We definitely shouldn't stop running. And then after a while, it'll be like, yeah, you're right. Stopping running's great. So rewiring doesn't take that long if you consider that many of us have been wiring our behaviors in for a number of years. Mm-hmm. But rewiring is about the big stuff, like stopping restriction, stopping running, changing your belief systems that thinner is better and fatter is not. It's also about the tiny, tiny day-to-day stuff. And I always say that when I had an eating disorder, it wasn't necessarily the things I did. It was the way I did them. So, for example, emptying the dishwasher. Now, emptying the dishwasher in itself is not an eating disorder behavior. Like, no one is going to look at a person emptying a dishwasher and say, you've got an eating disorder. That's not an eating disorder on its own. However, the way that I used to empty the dishwasher when I had an eating disorder was disordered. I would walk as far as possible. I'd take one plate at a time. I emptied the dishwasher in a very inefficient way. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't the actual activity of emptying the dishwasher that was problematic. It was the way I did it. And so I had to commit to rewiring the way I emptied the dishwasher. And I had to force myself to take a stack of plates at a time and go to the cupboard and put them all in the cupboard. And the first time that I ever did that, I felt like my brain was going to explode. Mm-hmm. Everything in my brain was saying, take one plate at a time. And I was like, no, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take like 10 plates and I'm going to walk them over and put them in. And it was emptying the dishwasher like a normal ass person was almost as difficult for me as stopping running was. So it's not just the big stuff, it's the small stuff as well. And that's what, when you are neurally rewiring your brain, and you have to understand that, yes, the big stuff is important, but you got to get it all out. You've got to change the way that you do a lot of the things that you do. And that's, what rewiring is. And it takes a lot of commitment because, like I said, your brain's going to have an opinion about it. My brain had a big opinion about the way I emptied my dishwasher that I had to overcome. But so the first time I emptied my dishwasher like a normal person, my brain had a big opinion about that, screamed a lot, lots of anxiety, guilt, shame, disgust, and all that stuff. And then the second day, there was still that, but it was a bit less. And then the third day, it was a bit less. And then like the fourth or fifth day, it wasn't even there anymore. I was like, should have done this 10 years ago. That's how it goes with rewiring. But the thing is, you also have to be very consistent. If I'd gone through all of that emotion about making the decision to empty the dishwasher like a normal person and done it that one day, but then the next day gone back to my eating disordered way, I was not rewiring anything. And then the day after that, I decided I was going to empty the dishwasher in a non-eating disordered way, it would have been just as hard again because I just reinforced the disordered way of doing things. So consistency and committing to that consistency and saying, hell or high water, from now on, I am emptying the dishwasher like a normal ass person.
I was exactly the same. For me, it was giving up on the weight, and then secondly, it was giving up the veganism, because even though I was doing it for the animals, it wasn't working for me, and I knew that was hindering my recovery. And day after day, just constantly doing that, starting off with eggs, adding in more and more and more, it get easier and easier. I feel like I had to give myself compassion, just like I was giving everybody else.
Absolutely. And I'm so, so proud of you that you did that, because you did that. First of all, you had all your own stuff to deal with, your own judgment, your own values, your own brain about, eating animals or animal products. And then you had the judgment of everybody sort of in probably your social circle that you had accumulated through many years of being vegan. That's going to be your identity that's going to change. And you're going to get all this backlash because, vegans are feisty, and you're going to get all this backlash. So not only did you have to contend with the stuff in your own head, but you had to contend with a lot of other people's shit as well. And so that really takes a heck of a lot of mental strength. But people with eating disorders, I do think that's a hardwired genetic trait as well. We have a heck of a lot of grit.
Yeah, totally.
So I just want to say thank you so much, Tabitha, for giving us your time. I'm just, every time we do one of these podcasts, I just have like these mind blown moments where I was like, man, I'm so effed up still. I think don't say that, Ryan. No, but that dishwasher story, I lived that. But the way I made breakfast was meticulous like that. I would like run up one thing at a time, drove me nuts.
Absolutely. And I could make a cup of tea in a disordered way. I could brush my teeth in a disordered way.
Ryan's concern all the time, which he's stuck on, is that he keeps getting stuck on micronutrients, which I told him he doesn't need to worry about that. It's his eating disorder doing that in a certain way.
I know. Yeah. Thank you. What were some things that you found were stigmatizing that you wanted to change? How far have we come in your mind's eye?
Well, the big long list, isn't there? I think, one of the first things is just sort of the type of person that is supposed to get an eating disorder. And I do think that that's changing. It's no longer this perception quite as much that it's a 14-year-old white girl that hates her body that gets an eating disorder. And I think that as the field has begun to understand energy deficit, and that any person can go into energy deficit and then could potentially develop an eating disorder, they're able to see that. The biggest though, so those things are kind of changing. That adults can get eating disorders, and that a person can develop an eating disorder way into their adult years. That men can get eating disorders, and that people who do not want to be thin more than anything else in the world before they have an eating disorder can get eating disorders as well. And then there's also different racial aspects. People of color are often overlooked. I think, though, the biggest underlying problem, and it's still as bad, is that in some respects, I think that a person with an eating disorder doesn't necessarily need it to be treated differently from a person without an eating disorder, with many, with regards to many things if they go into a doctor's office. But that's because I don't believe that any person, regardless of whether they have an eating disorder or not, or their body size, should be going into a doctor's office and be told to restrict food. And so the reason that happens is because our culture has an unconscious bias that weight loss is always good and weight gain is always bad.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem with that is that it's an unconscious bias, which means most people are not conscious that they have it. But we all have it in our culture. And so that means that doctors, nutritionists, healthcare providers are all brought up into this unconscious bias of weight loss is good and weight gain is bad, and that fat is bad and that thin is good. And so you do have people walking into doctors' offices and being told, without being examined and without being actually determined whether they're healthy or not, being told that they need to lose weight. And so that's until we can change that unconscious bias, there's always going to be this problem, because it's bad enough when a person with an eating disorder that eating disorder behavior is reinforced by anybody, including a doctor. Many doctors used to applaud me at how much I exercised. That was the last thing I needed.
Me too.
Many doctors used to say, well, gosh, aren't you skinny? That you're, and sound as if I was healthy. And that's, of course, not the way that you should talk to a person with an eating disorder, but it's also not the way that you should talk to a person without an eating disorder. If a person is in a normal BMI and they're excessively exercising and restricting food, they should be told not to. If a person is in a higher than normal BMI and they are excessively exercising, restricting food, purging, or any of those, they should be told not to. And so I think there's this issue that our doctors, our healthcare providers, and our culture still looks at a person's weight and makes a decision about their state of health based on that their weight, and not actually based on any metrics of their state of health. And so until that changes, it's going to continue to be difficult for people with eating disorders. It's going to be even more difficult for people with eating disorders who are in anything other than a stick-thin body. And it's going to be difficult for people with, all sorts of versions of disordered eating, when we're still being judged, that we're still in this unconscious bias that thin is always good and fat is always bad.
I relate to that because I've been doing a lot of support work for BEAT in the UK, and a lot of people are actually saying online, they're saying that they're getting turned away from their GPs because their GP says that they don't meet the BMI criteria. Mm-hmm. They're feeling as if they have to go away and lose more weight, and it's just sending them right back into the eating disorder, or even worse.
Right. And so I think that until it can be understood that the severity of an eating disorder should be determined by mental state markers rather than a person's weight, I think that it's going to be struggling. If a person is displaying all of the same mental state markers as somebody that has a very low weight, they're restricting food just as much, they're compulsively exercising, they're purging, they have obsessive thoughts around food, they have mental hunger, all of those things. If all of those things are going on, that person has a severe eating disorder, regardless of what weight they are. And until the field can catch up and actually begin to look at mental state markers and behaviors rather than body weight, it's just, we can try and make some changes and we can try and make some improvements, but people are still going to continue to get sicker rather than get better. And they have to get sicker to get admitted to treatment.
Yeah.
My GP actually said to me recently, when I regularly go for checking in my weight and things like that, also as well as my eating disorder nurse, but my eating disorder nurse has never gave me any therapy. The only thing that's ever really helped me is following your work and your book and things like that. I actually gave them a copy of your book. They're now using it in their eating disorder ward and things like that because they said that they've never seen anything like this, and they're trying to kind of implement things. But my doctor actually said to me the last time I was there to see him, he says, "You've no longer got an eating disorder." And I thought that's just a bit
right.
He just doesn't class me as having an eating disorder, even though because I don't have eating disorder thoughts, but it's still there. Yeah. I'm not going to kid myself on in that. But it just shows you the way they think, exactly what you were saying.
Right. And you know how difficult it is when you do have an eating disorder to advocate for yourself, to advocate against your own eating disorder. I should eat more food. So it's even more difficult when the healthcare providers are saying, no, you're good, you're fine, you don't have an eating disorder anymore. And you kind of know that you do. And so it's just how anybody can actually recover in that sort of environment sometimes boggles my mind. But people can and they do, because generally people with restrictive eating disorders are very smart, determined people that can do whatever they want when they put their mind to it. And if that was not the case, the death rate would be a heck of a lot higher than it is right now.
Yeah, even as well, I was in at my eating disorder nurse 2 weeks ago, and this is the thing that got me. If I had been in a bad place, this would have probably triggered me massively. But this was a Friday, and the dietitian that was actually standing next to us turned around to me and she says, "Where are you going to after this, Tommy? Are you doing anything today?" And I says, "No, I'm just going home after this." And she says, "You'll be glad to know this is our happy day of the week. This is the day where we eat fish and chips or whatever we want. We call it Fat Friday."
You need to invite me to this. I will come over there.
Wow. I mean, I just couldn't believe it, but that's just the way they seem to go on. It's crazy.
And that's a really great example of that sort of unconscious bias. It's just so ingrained that people don't even know that they are operating under that bias, and they're operating within that bias and talking in a way that reinforces that bias. Mm-hmm. And the problem with unconscious biases is that a lot of the time it's because it's a cultural thing. It's being taught to us when we're really young, before we can even know how to talk. And so if you can imagine that you're a baby and you're sitting in and you know, your mum's having a baby gathering. I can't remember what they call those when they get, you know, mums and toddlers groups. Yeah. And, you know, like as a baby, you're sitting there in this cot and the adults are talking, and you will undoubtedly at some point or many points be hearing those adults talking about weight loss as if it's a good thing and about weight gain as if it's a bad thing. And you're a baby, so you don't know what the words mean. But babies are paying attention to everything. That's kind of their only job. They just sit there and pay attention to everything. And so your brain at that point is picking up that these words, weight loss, obviously is good. It's getting good. And the words weight gain, that's bad. The humans are not reacting well to that. And so that's how unconscious bias works, that it's so cultural that it's everywhere, that even by the time you're 3, it's well ingrained. You know that weight loss is good, and you know that weight gain is bad, and you know that thin is good, and you know that fat is bad. And so then, you know, by the time you're 10, it's just deep rooted into this part of your brain that holds the belief systems about how the world works and what's true in the world. And that's why it's so damn difficult. Because, you know, our brains hold on to these things. Belief systems are very difficult in the brain to change for good reason. The brain's designed to be difficult about changing belief systems.
A lot of that recently, but
yeah. And so we're sort of fighting against this really big beast, not even in just our own, you know, many of us actually are able to identify this and we can start to change our own belief systems. But then we're sitting in a culture that's constantly reinforcing the belief system that we're trying to change. And if you're determined and if you're consistent and if you're stubborn, you can still change that belief system in your own head. Changing that belief system in the culture, mind you, that's a completely different beast.
But no, so is there anything, you'll keep on me. Is there anything you would like to leave us with, Tabitha, before we end this thing?
Oh, just the same old message I always leave us with. It's hard, but it's so worth it. And actually, if you think about it, it's kind of not even that hard, because it's eating and resting. And that's all that most people with eating disorders really want to do deep down, if they're honest. And the reason for that is because no matter how big your eating disorder is, your body at some level is still always communicating to you, human, I need food and rest. I need food and rest. I need food and rest. And so recovery really isn't, the recovery isn't the fight. Maintaining an eating disorder is the fight. And what happens when you decide, I'm going to recover, is you decide, I'm surrendering. I'm just letting my body take over. And that's actually easy if you allow it to be, and it can be enjoyable if you allow it to be. And so just, I think, and you know, there's always a lot of people on the fence. Like anybody listening to this podcast, a lot of people will be like, kind of, I'm listening to this podcast because I want to recover. It's also a form of mental hunger. I'm hoping that they'll tell me I can eat more food. And so, you know, there'll be a lot of people listening to this podcast that are on the fence. They're kind of trying to work out right now, well, how do I sort of eat more food? Because that's what I really want to do, and maintain my eating disorder. And I'm going to say, well, you can't. You know, but go full recovery or bust. Don't sit on the fence, because sitting on the fence is the worst of both worlds. And all you need to do really to fully recover is white flag it and say, body, all right, I'm yours. I'm just going to do whatever you tell me. And your body will lead you right to health.
I always say that quite a lot. We ask for permission for people with confirmation, instead, even though we know what we actually have to do ourselves. We've got to hear it from somebody else. It's a strange way of putting it, but that's what it seems like to me.
Mm-hmm.
I won't ask you anymore, Tommy. I get what you're saying. But anyway, thank you all for joining us and watching this thing. Thank you, Tabitha. Thank you, Tommy, as always.
Yeah,
And
really nice to meet you.
We'll see you in the next one.